Hi, good evening and welcome to the regularly scheduled Board of Directors for Marin Water on Tuesday, June 4th, 2025. Terry, if I could please have a roll call.
Good evening, Director Larry Russell,
Here.
Vice President Jed Smith.
Here.
Director Ranjiv Kush.
Here.
Director Diana Mayer.
Here.
And President Matt Sampson.
Here. Do we have any public comment on the adoption of the agenda?
There are none.
Okay, can I have a motion to adopt the agenda, please?
So moved.
Second.
Roll call, please.
Director Russell,
Aye.
Vice President Smith.
Aye.
Director Kush.
Aye.
Director Mayer.
Aye.
And President Sampson.
Yes.
Thank you.
Next item, announcement of closed session. Do we have any public comment on the closed session items?
There are none.
Okay, we'll go ahead and convene to closed session.
Thank you.
Okay, we have reconvened from closed session at 6:35 with no reportable action. And so with that, we'll move on to public comments.
There are none.
Great. Item number 6, Director and General Manager's announcements. Director Hornstein.
I have no items tonight.
Great, thank you. Director Kush.
Nothing from me. Thank you.
Director Smith.
Yeah, I just appreciated the recent communication that our communications department sent out in our bills. I thought it was a wonderful update on the district and our initiatives, both with turf to replacement and our big water project. So thank you for the group for doing that.
Great, thank you. Next up, item number 7, Board and Committee reports. Director Smith.
Great. On May 22nd, we had our Finance and Administration Committee meeting. We had our consultants, our insurance consultants, Alliant, provided a review of our estimated insurance premiums and risks and the global issues with insurance for agencies like ours. Not quite as rough as last year's increases. So happy that we have that support. The staff also provided a financial review and update and quarterly investment report, and you can access the meeting on our website for May 22nd Finance Administration Committee. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Director Kush.
We had a planning committee meeting on May 27th. And in that meeting, staff provided an overview of 2 proposed professional service agreements with 2 separate consultant firms for on-call environmental compliance and regulatory permit services. The item will be brought back to the June 17th board meeting for the board to consider approval of the proposed services agreements. Staff also provided an overview of the proposed construction work for the Bridgeway Pipeline Replacement Project in the city of Sausalito. This item will also be brought back to the June 17th board meeting for the board to consider approval of the construction contract award. Staff then provided an update on the Nicasio Spillway Modification Project, as well as a proposed award of a professional services agreement for boundary survey work. This item is on tonight's meeting agenda for the board to consider approval of the agreement. Staff also briefed the committee on the possible AMI implementation options. Public may access the staff reports and a video recording of the May 27th Planning Committee meeting on Marin Water's website.
Great, thank you. Director Mayer, any comments or committee updates from you? Great. And with that, moving on to the consent calendar, I'd like to go ahead and pull item number B from the consent calendar vote. And then Molly, point of clarification, would you like us to move forward with the rest of the items on consent and vote and then?
Yes, that'd be fine. If you're pulling one item, you can move with the other ones first, and then we can take that item up.
Okay,
to
great.
follow.
If I could have a motion to approve the consent calendar with the exception of item B.
Second.
Roll call.
Director Russell, Vice President Smith.
Aye.
Director Kush.
Aye.
Director Mayer.
Aye.
President Sampson.
Yes.
Thank you.
And item B, Ben, pulling this item just for a little bit more clarification on the Nicasio Valley project itself. I've had a few questions. I don't know if you'd be best to ask or should direct it at staff.
Yeah, Director of Engineering, Alex Anaya, is prepared to respond.
Great, thank you very much. Alex, looking at the contract, and this is more of a procedural piece, not actually the need for it or anything like that, but in overall time timeline of the work going to be performed? Do we have a start date, end date roughly?
Yeah, the survey work that's going to happen takes around 3 months to do, with the upfront being the actual research for the right of way, fee titles, and all the records that needs to be done. So it'll take 3 months start to finish once this contract gets approved.
Okay, great. And then when would residents of the affected areas, when do they start expecting to see people of trying to approach their property for access?
Probably be about a month and a half after they continue or start with the right of way research work. So that's when they could start expecting to see some contact from the surveyors out there. So.
Okay.
tha-
So
that's
great. So
about-
it sounds like we have ample time to do a leak. My next question would be the outreach to the community and the communication on who's going to be on their property, at what time, where, and then when, just so they have an understanding of our intent.
That is correct. And currently, the current survey that's happening out there has to do with the hydrology, which is mostly focused on, evaluating the current creeks, flood, inundation issues out there, as well as what the sediment transport. So currently, staff is reaching out to people right now and coordinating that work right now. But the same thing would be applicable when we start doing the land survey in that area.
Okay, great. And we'll be able to notice the residents with ample time, et cetera, and things like that.
That is correct.
And then we'll get, the consultant will gather all the data from this study and then prepare a report, which is going to be, I assume, presented to us at some point once it's all wrapped up.
That is correct. Actually, it'll also be filed with the county as part of a record of a survey, such as part of the Land Surveyors Act. So it'll be a permanent public record with the county, but it'll also be available to us to look at.
Okay, great. So it sounds like we're getting a lot of really good updated information from this that we'll be able to share with the public so they have the same set as well.
That is correct. So the survey will actually establish and outline what the inundation boundary is going to be every 100 feet with markers and, survey elevations on there. So that way we could better understand exactly what the inundation impact could be.
Great. Well, thank you very much for those additional questions. I appreciate you being here tonight to explain that because messaging for the community, I definitely understand their concerns and we want to be upfront with them. And it sounds like we are, especially what we're trying to get at, what we're trying to study. So thank you very much for that. No further questions from me. Any other additional questions from the board on item number B? Okay, great. Could I have a motion to approve item B from the consent calendar?
So moved.
Second.
Roll call, please.
Director Russell,
Aye.
Vice President Smith,
Aye.
Director Kusch,
Aye.
Director Mayer,
Aye.
President Sampson.
Yes.
And there were no comments on any of the consent items.
Great, thank you. Moving on to regular items, 9A, adopt the proposed operating capital budget for fiscal year 25-26.
All right, good evening, directors. My name is Brett Uppendahl. I'm the finance director for the district. And tonight we do have a budget adoption item. This is a 2-year budget for fiscal year 25-26 and fiscal year 26-27. This is a brief overview of the slides. Many of the slides you'll see today are a recap of what we've gone through over the last few months, and I will recap those processes that we did go over. But we will talk a little bit about the overall budget process here at the district, some budget summaries. We'll talk about the cost drivers that are really impacting the budget in this cycle. And then we'll flip over to recap some of the division operating budget summaries we had reviewed in the budget workshop. And we'll touch a little bit on the capital improvement program as well. And then our next steps today will be asking the board to adopt the 2-year budget. So in general, as an overview, our budget is a $186.5 million budget here for fiscal year 25-26. That includes both capital and operating funds. In total, that's a 14% increase from the prior year. You can see between capital and operating fund, the next two bullets down there, operating fund is increasing by about 4%, so very consistent with inflation and with kind of a standard year-over-year increase. The operating fund does cover our day-to-day operations, our maintenance costs here at the district, as well as our debt service funds. The capital fund, as you'll hear me say a few times tonight, is increasing by 36%, and that is by far the bulk of the increase in this budget this year, as well as next year. Currently, in the fiscal year 25-26 budget, that'll be a $67.2 million capital fund. That includes all of our CIP projects, includes water supply enhancement projects, vehicle and equipment replacement. And you'll also hear me talk a little bit later that it includes our grant-funded projects. As a reminder to the board and the public, we have a 2-year budget process with a mid-cycle review. So we'll ask for the board's adoption here today on our 2-year budget. We will come back in about a year from now just to do a pulse check on the budget to make sure we're still within the general assumptions and then kind of operating parameters. And so it's not just a set it and forget it type of a thing. It is really an ongoing process over the next 2 years. But we do put, the pieces in place to be able to have it run through for 2 years straight if there are no changes. You've seen this process map here a few times over the last couple months, and we've moved the arrow all the way over to the right now. So just as a reminder, again, it's an ongoing process with the budget, and it really is kind of a year-round and kind of years-long process as we get into it. So starting in the summer, you kind of take last year's data, get your year-end accounting done, you do the initial analysis on there. In the fall time, we kind of update the expenses that we do know, our baseline budget, kind of the day-to-day operations and some of the known costs, start to overlay our revenue and expense kind of drivers into there. In the winter, we met with all the different divisions, analyzed their budgets, looked at the last couple years of actuals, looked at what they needed in terms of new and emerging needs, what we didn't know beforehand, some of their proposed enhancements, and then we also looked at some of their uncontrollable costs, the things that are beyond their discretion, and started taking notes in terms of how that works into the overall financial picture. In the spring, we bring that all together for a district-wide prioritization process. We finalize our revenues to see if we're still on track or see if there's any changes that need to be made there. And then in the summer, you may recall in May, we did a budget workshop where we kind of did a deeper dive into each of the operating areas. We also did a planning committee focus on the capital budget. So we spent a lot of hours there looking into the finer details underneath all of the budget. And then here we are at that last bullet point there on the right in the budget adoption period. And I know that I've mentioned this a few times in some of the graphs, but I think it is also good to provide the public with kind of more context on how much we put into this budget process, and maybe to remind even the board for how many times you've had to hear me talk about this or how many times we've had staff up here going through the budget. But it is an important topic, and we do like to make sure we're giving ample time for board feedback, ample time for public feedback, and ample time for us to make sure we're getting all of our numbers right and dotting all of our I's and crossing all of our T's. This started in the public sphere in February, on February 27th with the Finance and Administration Committee. During that meeting, we talked about, what I've just talked about there, the recent trends, kind of overview of the general budget process. We talked a little bit about inflation and how that's impacting our budget. And kind of one of the key factors there was that inflation has been slowing lately. We are seeing areas where inflation still increases or is increasing faster than kind of normal inflation. Here at the district, the things that we buy tend to increase at a higher rate than overall consumer goods. And so we talked about this couple areas there that are impacting our budget. We gave initial revenue projections based on the first 6 months of the year at that time. We came back to the board about a month later in March. We talked about our bigger cost drivers, those being personnel costs, retiree obligations, and our water purchases. We did a deeper dive into the history there and some of the background and why those costs are going the direction they are going. In April, for our finance committee, we finalized our current year projections. And so that let us talk a little bit about our reserve balances, where we think we're going to end the year, where we think we need to maybe budget for within the current budget. We also talked about our efforts to put AMI into the budget this year, to find room in the budget to be able to add AMI as a funded project going forward. And I'll touch on this briefly on the reserve balances there. And I think we talked about it quite a bit in some of our prior meetings, but just to kind of make sure we're all on the same page here. So there's 2 chances really to impact reserves. Number one is in the budget process as kind of a pre-funding of reserves. If we know we have the revenues to support it, we can initially, identify funds to be put away to reserves as kind of the ongoing and kind of forward-looking plan. We will also have a chance at the end of the year to look and see how the year ended up. Did we have cost savings? Did we have revenue in excess of our budget? And then at that time, we'll also have another chance to place those dollars in reserves or move reserves around. And I think as this board has indicated, we want to look into potentially establishing a building reserve fund at that time. And we will look into how much is the right amount to fund that. And then in future years, maybe in future rate studies, we can also decide if there's a policy for funding that on the front end of the budget as well in terms of planned contributions to that reserve. Going to the planning committee, I mentioned in my opening remarks that the planning committee on April 22nd gave a deep dive into our overall CIP process, how we prioritize projects, how we incorporate risk analysis, how we incorporate master plans, in terms of how that builds each asset class within the CIP. I'll touch on those a little bit later today. And then on May 6th, we came and we had all the division directors here for a budget workshop in a public meeting in this room, talking through each of the different divisions' operations, their priorities, the cost drivers. We also additionally covered another recap on the capital budget there as well. So we've really kind of gone over the last 6 months for quite a few deep dives here, looked into some kind of longer term history and a little bit of forward looking. And now we've completed all of our work and we've submitted the budget in terms of each and every division's operating budget and the capital as well as the revenue. So those will be in the coming slides here as they all come together. Fiscal year 26. This is kind of a graphical look at how the dollars shake out within our budget. Again, $186 million for the overall budget. You can see the blue there on the left. I put those in both in blue together because those are essential operating budget. Our personnel services and our operations and maintenance are the two biggest parts of our operating budget. Together, they're a little over $100 million. Debt service there at the top. That's in gray because in my mind, it helps fund our capital program. Technically, it's paid by the operating budget, so it could have been a lighter shade of blue, I guess. But in my mind, that's kind of a core, funding mechanism that funds our capital projects. In addition to the cash funding there on the side, $67 million for capital projects. So roughly a third of our budget is capital. The other third is personnel, and then a little less than a third for operations and maintenance. Then you'll see at the bottom right there, we do have a contribution to reserves, a planned contribution to reserves in the budget this year. And that's split evenly between our ongoing contribution to the Water Supply Project Fund, as well as an additional 2.5 to continue building back our unrestricted reserve. Looking at it more kind of in numbers this way, in comparison to the prior year budgets and then kind of folding in 2 years in a row, you can see the increases I talked about at the very top. So our operating fund is now $114 million with a 4% increase compared to the prior year. We're expecting a 5% increase in the second year of the budget there on the right. You can see our capital fund is increasing by 36%. So it's currently at $67.2 million. And I'll talk about it a little bit later, but I think the larger picture here is that it's a 36% increase compared to the prior year. But if you look compared to 23-24, which was, still an increase, it's more than doubled since 23-24. And it will flatten off next year. You see it's actually a drop of 4% on the capital fund next year. And that's largely just grants that are expiring. So we have a lot of kind of front-loaded grants in the first year of the budget. And many of those will likely carry forward into the second year, but we're budgeting them all up front to make the funds available for the projects they are funding. Contributions to the reserves have stayed flat at $5 million the last 3 years. And then in 26-27, we're proposing to reduce that. So that would keep the Water Supply Project Fund intact, and we would reduce the contribution to unrestricted reserves at just $1 million for next year. And not to get too far into the weeds, but a part of that was to make sure we had funding for AMI in the second year of the budget. If you look at the expenditure by category, the bottom line are the same. It's just kind of sliced and diced differently. Again, you'll see that the personnel services are increasing modestly, 6% and then 4%. Operations are basically the same, 4% and then 6% in terms of year-over-year changes. So relatively flat, relatively in line with Bay Area levels of inflation. Debt service is 100% flat. Those are basically fixed each year. We have a fixed debt service schedule that keeps those payments flat each year. Capital projects, again, that'll follow the capital fund. That's the significant increase in this year's budget. And then reserves, again, flat over the first 3 years. And then in the second year of the budget, we are dropping that down a little bit. Cost drivers, as we've gone through.
Sorry to interrupt, but it is interesting that over the next 2 years, our budget stays quite flat in total. Now, I think that's driven, it's because it's mostly because our capital projects budget has stabilized, but it looks like we still have increases that would account for inflation around personnel services, operations, and maintenance.
So yeah, that's exactly right. There is a slight increase in the overall budget, and there would be, if there was not grants in here, it would look a lot more kind of evenly shaped, right? So basically, if we had no grants in the picture, you'd kind of see this. It would still be leveling off, but it'd be kind of a more slow leveling. This year, what kind of happened is we're so successful in bringing grants in that we had a slow and steady start going, and then we are front loading with about $6 million of grants in the first year, and then that's dropping off to kind of a more $1 million level or so. So about a $5 million extra bump in year one, again, it's good news. It's attributable to our good grant program and pulling funds in that's supporting not only the Marin City and canal pipelines, but also a lot of the watershed work. So we're front loading that, kind of gives it a little bit of leapiness kind of in the overall scheme, but it is still intended, it's intended to flatten out a little bit over time, but not as dramatically as these slides may indicate.
Okay, yeah, I remember now. We had the same conversation the last finance committee meeting. Okay, got it.
Have you arrived at a rationale for reserves? Because that's kind of a loose goose.
Well, I mean, I think I've maintained my rationale the entire way through that I think you have to have a balance. I think having more reserves is never a bad thing, but you don't want to just be holding funds for the sake of holding funds. And so I think we've tried to come up with some good formulas and kind of a well-balanced layering of those, and we have those, reflected in our reserve policies. And I think it was easier at the beginning because we had, very low reserves. So obviously the answer was we need more in order to be a well-funded organization. And I think, as shown in this kind of planned decline in year 2, I think now we're basically saying, I think we're well-funded in many areas. It should be a very specific use now that we are holding funds for, such as a building replacement fund or such as water projects. But in terms of unrestricted or unplanned reserves, we don't need to intentionally raise those. I think going forward, we're at a pretty good place for that.
Well, I'm not sure I heard an answer there, but, there are guidelines. There's 6 months that's been tossed out and 3 months and all kinds of variations. Tiburon, as far as I know, is still operating with a 3-year reserve, which seems a bit excessive to me. But, it's a hard call.
It is.
Ask Jesse Ventura with Wisconsin, what happened there. He did what was logical, sorta, but then didn't work out so well.
Every agency is different. I think you have to take the full picture into account. Is where's your risks at? Where's your revenue coming from? What could happen in a year or two? And we took all that guidance into our current policies. And so I think the unrestricted operating, we try to have about 3 months, and we're getting pretty close to that. After that, it's, as I think you've mentioned a few times, you can kind of be flexible in some of those buckets, but you also want to be pretty intentional about why you're raising funds so that you can
Absolutely.
keep funds there and not have to unintentionally cut your budget down the line. So I guess I would say it's an ongoing process, and I think we should check it probably every couple of years to make sure it still stands up. And I think we've done a pretty good job of that in the last 2 years of at least documenting why we're holding these funds in reserve.
And sorry, Larry, did you have more?
Only one more thing, never forget that the root of it is drought reserve. So, and it was used amply for exactly that purpose of stabilizing rates during drought.
Yes.
And that was going to be my question is, do the drought rates that we put into play, does that inform your thought process around the reserves at all?
To me, it does, definitely. I mean, I think, to Director Russell's point, the drought reserve is one of the main reasons why you have that, because you have to keep the water flowing and you need to keep the operations going in times of either less revenue because of cutbacks, or in our case, we had the double whammy where we got cutbacks in use, so less revenue happened, and we also had to pay more for the water to bring in. So knowing that we can get hit on both sides of that, I think, helps inform that. But I do think having drought reserve or drought rates in place, if we need to call on them, very much mitigates that need. I would probably go a step further and also say that, the general structure of our rates now also kind of helps mitigate that a little bit with kind of a lower floor in a certain sense with the tier 1 being reduced. So I think that does help the low end of that kind of, spectrum if you get to that point. So I guess I would say we're in a much better place for a variety of reasons in terms of reserves.
Thank you.
For the district, yeah.
One more thing. One thing I did a little calc while you were talking. It comes out to about $3,100 per service.
On the
give or
budget?
take. It's divided by 60,000. And so that comes out to some number like $250 average bill. Obviously, there are bigger users, San Quentin, some of the parks and cities, which brings that number down even further. But that seems to be a fairly reasonable number to me. 250, it's not a killer number. Obviously, the lowest users would find that probably very objectionable, but normal user, I think that's, especially after PG&E's rate increases have really.
Yeah, I mean, that's something we'd look at with the rate, studies each year, and affordability, I think, for our user base is always a concern. And I think to that end, I think we do a pretty good job of diversifying our revenue. So it's not all coming from rates, right? We do have other sources coming in. As I mentioned, grants here today. We talked about capacity charges a few weeks ago. We have non-rate revenues as well. And then we do have our discount programs for those that qualify. So it's a challenge. It's an ongoing challenge of affordability versus the required investment. And we talked about during the last rate cycle quite a bit. The economies of scale and the normal ways you would spread these costs out in a large organization are not always there for us. And so there is a reality there that it is it's a challenge to get the proper amount of funding and also to maintain that affordability focus. So we'll be endeavoring in that challenge again soon in the next rate cycle. But for now, I think, we've struck a pretty good balance, I think.
Agree.
Okay, cost drivers, and these shouldn't be a surprise to you by now. Again, capital projects, we'll talk about the specifics there in a few slides, but that is by far the biggest cost driver in this year's budget. Personnel services, closer to that 5%, kind of 3 to 5% target you'd hope for. And I would say that the higher end this year, the kind of pushing it towards 5% is more driven by healthcare costs and kind of the increases that we saw in health insurance, those being around the 9 or 10% range. And I think I may have also mentioned that we had an increase in our retiree health evaluation. However, that increase in retiree health, our OPEB accounts, was more kind of bringing it back towards more normal levels, where we had 2 years of a nice little windfall from some of those investment returns during the COVID time. So in my mind, we're back to kind of a steady state there on personnel services. There's always, those can change drastically going forward. But for the time being, I feel like we're in a pretty good place there. Purchased water, an increase of 8%, consistent with what we had planned for in our water rate study. Still on the higher end historically from what we're getting from our partners in Sonoma, but I think they do a really good process of at least explaining where their budget is going for and kind of cluing in the contractors for where future increases will come from. And so they were very transparent throughout the process this year, and we were able to budget for it accurately. So I think that again is in line with expectations. The next 3 items are much smaller, items within our budget. Professional fees are going up quite a bit as we are making sure we're leveraging outside resources where we can. A lot of this goes back to some of our technology modernization efforts as we're turning some of our contracts of old on-premise kind of owned equipment into more support contracts over time. So professional fees, I do think will continue to be somewhat of a cost driver in the budget going forward. Electricity, we talked about PG&E, that's going up quite a bit each and every year. We're seeing about 11% increase so far on the whole this year in the budget. Taxes, fees, and licenses, those are largely beyond our control. Those are kind of a product of being a regulated entity here. We're in water. We have quite a few state regulators and national regulators, and we also have our cost of doing business when it comes to banking fees and credit card charges and whatnot. So that's really what's driving that line in the budget. And then insurance, we talked about at the last finance committee. We're expecting, relatively, almost double-digit increases this year, around 9 or 10%, and we're expecting that to probably happen, consistently over the next couple of years as the insurance market continues to incur losses and then pass those losses on to the entities that use their insurance. So those are the biggest, drivers of the budget, and you'll see those kind of throughout the next presentation or the rest of the presentation and the different department budgets. But it is good to highlight kind of what is pushing the budget in the direction it's going. I think it's good to take a historical look at this, and you've seen this slide before as well. I think looking back over the last 5 or 10 years, obviously there's been a lot going on in the last 5 or 10 years, not only here, but across the nation. But nonetheless, our operating budget has increased at about 5% per year. And so that is really, to be expected. And like I said, in line with other public agencies, and especially given the fact that our particular business here is exposed to prices that are kind of above and beyond the normal consumer goods. And so 5% increase over the past 10 years, kind of slow and steady. The capital numbers there, the gray on the bottom, is really kind of the focus of this budget and this whole rate cycle. And I was kind of pointing out that in the 1920, 2021 range, we basically had a 4-to-1 ratio, about $80 million to $20 million in terms of operating to capital. That's probably a bit low on capital. We were cash funding then. That was the beginning of the CMF. And you can see the last 3 or 4 years as we've restructured our rates and restructured our priorities, that capital number has gone from the mid-20s all the way into the 60s. So we're more than doubling, and in some cases closer to tripling our capital budget. And that really is the the root of all this. That is kind of where we're raising money and it's where we're spending money. So it is hopefully clear to the public, hopefully clear to the board, that is where the investments are going within this budget and within this district into the capital fund. Over time, that's been about a doubling increase there, about 12% if you average it over the past 10 years. But as my note at the bottom says, it's more than doubled since 2023. So how do we get the revenues to pay for all this? So the revenues here, as the board knows, were especially the top line there. The rate revenues were set as part of the 4-year rate setting process that we went through with the cost of service study and the last 2 years. So you can see there that the rate revenue is expected to increase about 9% next year compared to the prior year. And you can look kind of at the numbers there, within the different charges. And basically what's happening is fixed fees are increasing at exactly 3%. And then water sales is increasing higher. So it's basically continuing kind of that shift away from the fixed fee or, more towards variable fees. So users have more control over, their budgets and how much they're being charged. And it's more proportional in our mind. It's more proportional as we set the rates up to shift a little bit of this towards the variability in usage as opposed to charging fixed fees to recover our costs. So you can see that kind of, evening out a little bit in that second year of the budget. But in the first year, we still are raising the variable charges, at a higher rate than we are raising our fixed fees. And again, it's 6% in the second year and 9% in the first year for rates.
Brett, can you just help me understand why we see a 1% decrease in the CMF fee in the first year?
Yeah. So that is not an actual decrease in the fee charged to customers. What that is that's a recognition of the CMF waiver that we have. So we have a program in place where if your meter has been upsized for fire sprinkler purposes only, we let you be charged at the lower level and at the level that you would have otherwise been charged. And so there's a process for that. And so when we first did the rate study, we did the kind of the straight calculation of how much, all the meters we have in the district and all the revenues that would bring in, and we backfilled it with non-rate revenue. This is a recognition of how much money we're actually getting in. So it's just saying when you kind of take into account all those waivers and all those adjustments, this is how much cash is actually coming into the district, from the CMF. So individuals will not see a decrease in their CMF. It'll go up again by 3% like the other fixed fee. But it's me looking at this saying, we're not going to bring that level of revenue in because we have these waivers that are out there. And so this is just a more realistic figure for the actual cash coming in the door.
Thank you.
Seems to me that with shifting back to the variable rate as opposed to the fixed fee, that puts more pressure on the reserves too,
Yes,
because
it's a trade-off.
you're much more vulnerable.
Yeah. It's a trade-off, but I think as we talked about in the last kind of segment, it's a trade-off that's balanced by higher reserves and also by drought rates. But it definitely does add to the variability and it's something we have to watch closer.
Of course, the drought rates have been there for years. They were there when I started in 2004. There was a systematic approach to increasing the rates if you institute mandatory conservation.
But then that went away.
No, it didn't. It was just a confusion about the 218.
Yeah, so to clarify, my understanding at least is that in the last rate setting process, we put that in there as more of an automatic type of an increase or kind of enacting the drought rates without having to go through a full 218 process. They were already disclosed and already decided, and the calculations were already fully baked in terms of how those drought rates would apply, and they passed the 218 muster. Whereas in the past, we would have had to do special studies and special outreach in order to.
It went through the
implement rates.
218 before.
Did it?
Yeah, there's a file in your system from Mary about exactly that issue.
Yeah, I think at the time we looked at that and did not find the support for those rates, which is why we wanted to make sure that we were doing that very intentionally in the last rate setting process.
And then, so looking to the bottom part of this box here, so rate revenues obviously are by far the largest revenue source here for the district, 165 million of the total 185, but the other revenues are still significant for the district. Fire flow fees, that is, used entirely to increase the firefighting capacity across the district, and that is helped prioritized by fire chiefs across the district here. Capacity charges, we just went through a big study there. Those will help over time. Those are hard to budget because they're project dependent. And so it's hard to know exactly what's coming in there. We tend to use just a longer term average for the budget there. But all the revenues that we do receive on connection and capacity charges go back into the capital fund and help us be able to fund capital projects going forward. Rents, permits, and fees, those have been on a steady kind of annual increase for the past couple of years. And I know we did a bigger project on some of our rents there, especially on our Mount Tam properties 2 or 3 years ago to renegotiate that deal. Grants, as I mentioned at the top, those are much higher this year than they have been in the past, looking at a total of 8.9 million in this year's budget, much larger than we've had in prior years. And then the other big change here is interest earnings, right? You can see that they're second from the bottom. When we set the budget last time, I don't think we necessarily foresaw rates going so high for so long. And so this is a resetting of that. This is basically saying now we're kind of in a new phase where rates are in the 3s and 4% now. I'm projecting them to go down a little bit over the next 2 years, just kind of generally coming back towards the average. And so you can see those resetting now towards kind of the current year revenues. And then, starting next year, starting to go down by 10, 15, 20% per year. Obviously, that's a guess. I don't exactly know where rates will go, but it's a recognition that they're likely to go down more likely than go up. And if they don't, then that's just more revenue for the district to be able to have to provide services. So it's a benefit to our customers as it offsets any rate revenue that they would have to otherwise be incurring. And then obviously miscellaneous is just a small category of little things. So overall revenues are increasing 13%. And then I would say, looking more to the impact on customers, total rate revenue is increasing by 9% this year.
I have a question about fire flow.
Mhm.
It seems to me we're about halfway through that second round of fire flow. I kind of remembered it was 10 years. That's kind of what I remember.
Fire flow is due to expire in 2031. So we're probably a little bit farther than halfway through in terms of timeline.
Yeah.
In 2031, I think it goes till.
And is it the feeling that we're likely to need a renewal, or will we have accomplished what we need to accomplish? And I understand you may not know that answer. I'm not sure even Alex knows that answer. But
I don't know the answer off the top of my head. I think in general, there's a lot of work to be done in terms of shoring up our fire flow across the district. There's always probably a larger list of projects than we have funding for. But it's also my understanding this is a fire flow fee that gets voted on by the electorate.
that's why I brought it up.
And
Yeah.
so I think they will probably decide more so than we will.
Well,
but
not
projects
exactly,
probably.
because, we make the decision if it's needed.
Yeah.
And it will, along with the fire folks, and then we go out with a ballot initiative. So it's not exactly decided it's ultimately decided by the voter. That's true. But the initiative comes from the water district.
Yeah. So it's obviously something we will look at over the next couple of years. And I expect this is not the end of that conversation.
Yeah.
Brett, question on the grants. Are those grants for which we will be eligible again, or are they one-time deals? I don't remember where they're from.
I mean, I have a list of those. I can pull it up here. I think in general, grants are more one-time in nature. So a lot of these that do come out, we're applying for them years ahead of time. We have projects that match these grants. Funding cycles tend to come out, kind of in lumps, depending on the administration or the federal government at the time. And so I would expect, and for budgeting purposes, I would not expect to rely on grants in the long term. I think we like to wait till we're, very sure we're going to get the grants before we program them. Because even once they're programmed, they can be challenging to get. They can be challenging to qualify all the expenses for. But I think our staff does a really good job at identifying opportunities and kind of aligning our projects towards, how we can best get those funded by any kind of state or federal funds. So short answer is I treat them as one time in my mind, but I know that our staff will continue looking for grants. So there will be a grant line in the budget. It just probably won't be the exact same grants.
And what was the reason for having such a drastic increase in that amount in such a short time?
Well, other than our ongoing work, and I think we have a couple big ones in here for some of our pipeline replacement projects in Marin City and in the canal area, but Sean and his team have just done a really good job of aligning a lot of our watershed restoration work with the funding that's available through some of the state agencies. So I don't know if I would probably defer to Sean and his team over, the success, the recent success, but I think it's just ongoing efforts and just knowing kind of the levers to pull and knowing where the funds are and how we can modify our projects to match that. And I think they've just done a really good job of that.
And as Brett noted, that work continues. And what this is a pretty high number for us, and it's great to see. We have seen an increase over time, but trees don't grow to the sky, and there'll be some down years and up years. But we do have a pretty good program going in fact, the end of this month, we're going to DC to talk to some funders to keep kind of the pipeline going to the extent we can.
Thank you.
Yeah, we got a gift for the Marin City. Basically, that's the jump, as I recall.
Yeah, no, that is a good point.
Mhm.
$6 million, and that was really developed in partnership with Marin City, and
Mhm.
they kind of helped get that over the finish line. So that was a big project for us, grant funded.
So same numbers here, just kind of graphical representation. And again, I can't underscore how much, the rate revenue is the big piece here. And that's why each month we talk about it in the finance committee. And that's why that is the bulk of our work looking there. And then, I think just to follow along there, you can see fire flow is a pretty sizable chunk, and then grants have gotten much bigger here. So just another way of underscoring the importance of our rate revenue, the importance of kind of supplementing that where we can. And then what this slide does here is it breaks down the rate revenue. So if you took the big pie on the side of the last one and just show where the rates are coming from, water sales being the variable portion to Director Russell's comment, those are 70% of our overall revenue. Watershed management fee at the top there, 3% of our revenue, but that's also variable. So those two in my mind kind of go together in terms of the overall direction, and together they make nearly 3/4 or 73% of our budget. Service charges and capital maintenance fee. Core stabilizing functions for the rates there. Those are fixed fees, those we can count on each and every year. Together they make up a little over 25% of the budget. So a smaller portion than they used to be, but still a very important kind of piece of the overall financial picture. All right, so I'm going to transition over here to some of the division and kind of capital budget. So again, just to remind the board and the public, we have 5 operating divisions here at the bottom: administration, engineering, operations, watershed, and water resources. We all report up to the general manager, and general counsel, as well as the general manager, both report up to the board of directors. Within each division, this is kind of how the budgets shake out in comparison to each other. You'll see operations on the bottom left there is by far the biggest division that we have, well over 1/4 of the overall budget here within the district. We'll talk about what that covers. And then the other divisions are relatively the same size, where they're 8 to 10% of the budget, similar staffing models for the most part. I think admin services might have a little bit more than the other divisions. We'll see that in a slide or two here. And then the GM, board and legal, relatively small overall in terms of staffing and in terms of overall budget there at 4%. The natural question is interdepartmental there at the top left. What goes into that? That is really kind of the district-wide costs that don't belong in one specific division. And so a lot of what we get there is debt service. We get our purchased water in there, and we get some of our retiree obligations and health insurance go into that category. So it really is these larger payments that are more fixed in nature but don't belong in one specific department. And so we put them in the interdepartmental group. We pay for insurance out of there as well. FTE by division, so we're at 254 now. If we look at the fiscal year 25-26 budget there, that has grown by 9 positions since the last budget, and we chronicle it here. And in terms of the slides, some of it is net growth, and some of it is just changing between departments. And so I've put a couple of notes there where the bigger changes were, but admin services, the main jump there from 38 to 46 is the addition of IT. So IT used to be in engineering, and it's been moved over to admin services in the last 2 years. Water resources is net flat, although they've had probably some 2 or 3 movements going on there. They've taken on the AMI program, and then they've moved safety out, and safety's gone to watershed. So a little bit of changing seats here. Watershed has a net increase of 4, and we'll talk about that in a slide or two, but that is really kind of targeted additions there within watershed in terms of rangers and in terms of grant-funded natural resource technicians. They do have 1 limited term position there as well. Engineering shows a slight drop, but that is really a drop of about 10 from IT, and then the addition of 4 for capital planning. So it's a drop of 10 offset by addition for capital planning. Then operations, we added 2 valve exercisers in the last budget, and then we've shifted a couple people around since then. So they've basically stayed flat. They're at around 97. How does that compare historically? So you can see this in the last 10 years or so again. We are at the higher level, the higher end of where we've been at in terms of FTEs, historically. But I think, and I do believe this too, that the additions we've done since 2023 and 24 have been very targeted and very, intentional, as it's shown down there. 4 for engineering. You have a doubling or tripling of the capital budget, and I think you need some people to actually do the work. So we've added 4 in engineering. I would guess we probably need more there to really actually complete a lot of these projects going forward. I know that's something that Alex looks at, quite often. Within the watershed, we've had a big focus on making sure we have enough rangers to staff operations out there. We've got a grant-funded fisheries position, and we have a limited-term vegetation management position out there as well. And Sean's done a good way of finding funds within his own budget and also getting grant funds to support these positions. Then I mentioned we have 2 valve exercises that we're at to really kind of make sure that our system is is up and running to make sure we're able to, address the system when it's a leak or when it's an emergency repair, and to make sure we don't get too far behind on some of our ongoing maintenance. And if I recall correctly, those are positions that were removed from the budget years ago due to budget cuts, and so they were just the most important positions to add back to make sure our system is up and running and able to
Right.
be.
These are approved numbers, but not actuals, right? Because I think we were down to like 219, I think, in 2022.
That's exactly right. So yeah, these are the approved staffing levels, and each year actuals will, typically be at least 10% lower, and probably in some years closer to 20% lower. So we're doing our best to get back to the full staffing here, but there is always going to be some natural vacancies within this. So this is the approved number. And then I'm not going to go through each division in the same level of detail that we did in the budget workshops, but I did want to kind of highlight what is in each division's budget. And, some of this is new funding. Some of it, is kind of maintaining what was in last year's budget. But within admin services, the 4 or 5 main things that are driving our budget there. Number one, in IT and in finance and in customer service as well, we have technology modernization efforts. That's not only the SAP project, but also Microsoft 365 and the new online bill payment system that we have. We also are funding in the next 2 years another cost of service study for water rates. So kind of harkening back to the conversation with Director Russell, we will be going down that path again within the next year or so to take a look at our rates and kind of start shaping the financial plan for the next 4 years. We do have targeted funding in there for outreach and marketing. A lot of that comes through Adrian's budget and communications, and a lot of that is in support of other district initiatives, including water efficiency. And then we also have training and employee engagement. So that's increased in the last 2 years. We have added in 1 HR staff as well for training and employee engagement. And so this is the beginning of kind of the full budget for that staff to make sure we are supporting all divisions and supporting all of our different trades and different professions with focused employee engagement and with training at all levels there. Then the operations division, it's basically a flat budget as you heard Darren talk about a couple weeks ago, but the big drivers for them are the water treatment costs. And a lot of that is kind of purchasing the chemicals and electricity required for water treatment. And then there's system-wide pipeline maintenance. And so that's just basically a kind of a long way of saying when they need to maintain and or fix emergency repairs, that is a big cost driver within their budget. Again, we've been fortunate the last 2 years to not see additional spikes in terms of, paving contracts and in terms of costs associated with leaks. And I think Darren's team has done a really good job of minimizing that where they can. And the district's worked well on kind of minimizing the cost escalations, at least associated with paving requirements. And so we're fortunate to see that mostly flat, but it still is a big driver of activity and of overall costs for Darren and the operations division. And then in engineering, again, the operating budget is basically flat for Alex. It's really kind of the capital improvement program that is driving a lot of the activity and a lot of the costs there. I didn't mention it in the staffing, but Alex's team in engineering has also taken on our GIS program and merged that with the records division. And then they're also responsible for some of the longer term planning and compliance with dam safety and the master planning efforts that we do through Alicia's team. So we have a lot of kind of bigger efforts going there. Their efforts are seen more in the capital program than the operations, but they are still big drivers of the activity.
So Brett,
day-to-day.
we briefly touched on this in the workshop, but there was news today. So just kind of recognizing that what we don't account for in here, because Brett said he didn't have a crystal ball, is impacts from tariffs. And we buy a lot of steel. So we are expecting, if we think about the capital program, I'm not sure, the relationship of pipes to project costs, but we'll see it for sure. If we think about steel tanks, that could be significant, but it's also stuff like valves. And so I think we'll see it in the capital program and in the operating program. We just, at this point don't have a way to understand what that will be. And as we talked about, we have reserves, so we're confident we can manage through it, but we do expect to get maybe a non-trivial hit from how these flow out.
In our last 2 divisions here, watershed, a lot of their work is focused on the creek restoration projects in Lagunitas Creek. BIFIP, which is our fire and fuels reduction programs out there. That is ongoing work, slight increases there, but ongoing work, and a lot of that is grant funded as well. And then and Sean's budget also contains increased funding for watershed roads and trails improvements. And so those are, I think, well documented, and we have a lot of those efforts on our minds as we're working through the watershed budget, working through our watershed committee meetings. And finally, water resources here is the newest division here at the district. You'll see Paul and Lucy often up here talking about the water supply projects, atmospheric river capture, or the ARC project. We also have the Nicasio spillway modification that we're working on. AMI is a new program under Paul and his team there. So that again will be a big effort for his team in the next 6 months and obviously the next couple of years. Water efficiency or conservation is in water resources as well. And so we did a lot of that work last year with the master plan. And so this is continuing a lot of those efforts and targeting efforts towards high water users and towards outside water use. They also handle all of our regulatory fees and permitting for water quality. And so that's a lot of working with the state and a lot of, their cost increases just for working with them and for monitoring water quality across the entire district. And then finally, water rights, which is no small endeavor either. And that also goes through Paul's division there in water resources. So those are the drivers, a lot of their work and a lot of their costs within those divisions. And as I mentioned, the capital improvement program really is the primary cost driver across the district. And there's a couple different ways of summarizing this, and then we have all the projects printed in the back of the budget book as well. But I think this chart here, to me at least, kind of shows the significant increase, since 22-23, when our old baseline was in the $20 million range. You can see the year-over-year kind of intentional increase towards capital here, starting the first year of the new rates and continuing here into this year. As I think Alex and Alicia spent a lot of time on in May and in April, our capital investments are really designed, to target our aging and our failing infrastructure, and make sure that as we're making standard repairs and planning out projects, we're also incorporating fire hardening and security improvements where we can. They definitely take a risk-based approach to target the critical assets because we do have so many out there. We have over 900 miles of pipe and over 100 pump stations. So, obviously they're all due for replacement at some time. But I think the team does a great job of using that risk-based approach and being informed by the master plans and really trying to find projects that have multiple issues and multiple benefits. So we're getting more of a bang for our buck when we are doing projects out there. And then as he talked about as well in the capital planning part of the budget workshop, we're also looking into energy efficiency opportunities within any capital planning efforts that we do have. So ongoing effort. I know that, that probably minimizes my one slide or minimizes a lot of work that the capital planning team does. But I do think they've spent a lot of time explaining this and then we have a lot of detail in the budget here. You can see the main asset classes that I'm showing at the top there are 8 kind of primary, 7 primary asset classes. Pipelines being the year-over-year investment we sustain throughout. And that's been a big target of our kind of deferred maintenance backlog we're working on there. So where we were at $8 billion a year 3 years ago, and we're pushing that up to $15 million a year and $16 million next year. And we'll be over $21 million a year in pipelines starting in 26-27. We also have pump stations and storage tanks, which are kind of more bread and butter. Storage tanks can be a little bit tricky. And right now, the proposed budget for 25-26 does include our Pine Mountain tanks in there as well. Treatment plants will start to get a little more funding in the next couple of years as well as we start addressing the clarifier out there. And then as you go down to system improvements is really capturing a lot of our kind of longer term efforts and some of our water supply planning. So that's really where the bumps are there at the bottom. The CIP highlights, as I started to talk about there, high-risk pipeline projects that we've talked about funding and kind of being nimble for funding opportunities is the Wolfpack Ridge Crossing, North Marin Line Creek Crossing. Pine Mountain Tunnel I mentioned there, it's a multi-year project. We're beginning phase 2 in 25-26, so phase 1 will be complete. Phase 2 begins this summer. And just to remind the board and the public, that is taking $2 million storage tanks, and it's adding capacity and storage to the Ross Valley area, and also really helps our firefighting capacity in that area as well. Pump stations, we're finally able to tackle the Tokoloma pump station project, which is well beyond its useful life. And I think as we've talked about that particular project many times, we're having to search far and wide for even parts to fit that because it's such an old piece of machinery. And so that has multi benefits, not only just in terms of the efficiency of that pump station, but it's going to be a critical piece of our transmission pipelines as we kind of work on this atmospheric river capture project and any future phases of moving water from Nicasio into our system. Fairfax Manor is another one that kind of came on late, but it is a big fix and it's a relatively expensive fix for us, but we are taking the time to make improvements there and also adding fire hardening to that project. But that one did come across us as unidentified in the first 2 years of the budget, and now that has become a high priority pump station project for us to fix and to get back running over the next year. So those are some of the highlights that Alex and his capital team went through. I'm happy to answer any more questions.
Yeah, I'm just a little surprised you don't have Castagna listed in that pump station.
Castagna listed in the pump station projects.
Yeah. I thought the electrical had to be done regardless of its.
I mean, so there's, a huge list of projects. I just highlighted the bigger
You
ones.
just picked those. I got it.
I can certainly pull up Castagna if you want me to, but
No.
yeah, I think I'm not sure on Castagna. I think we pulled that one. Did we pull that one off, or is it funded in the current year? It's not in the budget for Castagna. I'm not sure. I don't know, Alex, if you have a.
Alex,
Yeah.
yeah, I recall there was a piece.
Yeah, the current funding is going to be carried forward because we had to do the redesign based on how we're going to fit Castagna into the atmospheric river project. So we're looking to do the redesign and get that back upon about 2 months, and we'll be advertising the project. So we're going to be carrying forward that funding to make sure we do that pump and improvement and the surge tank at Ignacio.
So it's already budgeted.
Correct. So we're just making sure we're carrying that funding forward.
Thank you.
So this will be my last slide. I'm happy to finish this and then take questions as we go through. But the total budget of 186 million, again, is a 14% increase overall. 4% of the increase comes to the capital operating fund, and 36% increase is attributable to the capital fund. Our priorities throughout the budget here are guided by our strategic plan, annual work plans, master plans, and they do include water supply resiliency, water system improvements, watershed restoration efforts, and then technology modernization. Revenues to support all of our capital investments and our operating expenditures are primarily provided by customer rates. And as we've talked about in the finance committees, our revenue projections are very much consistent with the existing rate structure. So we don't have any major changes there to report or to adjust to. And then my recommendation, staff recommendation here for the board is to adopt the proposed capital and operating budget for 25-26 and for fiscal year 26-27. That concludes my overview. I'm happy to take questions.
Brett, thank you very much for that in-depth presentation. And I just want to say a personal thank you for getting the presentation available last week. It was a big deal, so thank you. And with that, we'll go ahead and open up the questions.
I just want to thank you, Brett, for the very detailed presentation and for spending extra time with me to go over some of the things in there I didn't understand. It was really, really helpful. So thank you.
Yeah, great. Brett, I think that this shows an enormous amount of work from you and your team and the whole agency. I think it's an extremely thoughtful plan. And it is a remarkable change from when we came into office 2.5 years ago, when we were losing $1 million a month for nearly 2 years from our plans, and had an enormous amount of work to do to catch up on maintenance, and had depleted our reserves from in the mid 30s to in the 10 million range. So the reserves serve their purpose, but now we've set a rate structure that we believe will help us in times of drought, and have engaged in capital projects that are historic for our county and for our customers, that we should be proud of. Multiple times of effort and investment in critical infrastructure projects that is just getting started. I'm very supportive of the reserves that we've created. It shows prudence and thoughtfulness, as tough times will no doubt happen again. And I appreciate some of the shifts that you've made towards AMI and others that I think are very thoughtful. So I'm proud of the difficult decisions that we've made to get to this point. And this agency is in remarkable financial stability in a way that I hope will lead us for the years to come.
Thank you. Director Russell.
Only one comment. That last slide, I think you need to add conservation into the list of priorities. I think that's frankly inexcusable not to include that in there. You had a list of things like water supply and things like that, about the middle of the slide. But I think you need to add that in because of its easy implementation, relatively low cost with a big impact.
Great. Director Kush.
Yeah, thanks, Brett. Another great presentation. Just, it was really good, helpful to have the full proposed budget ahead of time as well to review, because I've been curious what, as we went through the workshop, we were comparing budgets to budgets. So budgets from 23, 24, 25 going on. But in the actual proposed budget, you include our actuals for 23, 24. Of course, we don't have them for 24, 25, right? And it's interesting to look at those. If you look at our 23, 24 budget, it was about 142 million, and our revenues were at 139. So almost very close in terms of revenues. Only, small difference there. But our expenditures were quite a bit lower than our budget in 23, 24 at about 110 million. And I think so. Some of that difference of it's about 29 million was due to probably the ramp up time for the capital improvement project. And, there was, I know, some rollover of CIP budget that we had talked about. But I don't think that includes that covers all of the difference between revenues and the actual expenditures in 23, 24. So I was just kind of coming back to that discussion about reserves. Does the surplus then, was that then captured in reserves? And I guess that's one question. And then, as you've been showing us monthly budgets to actuals for this current fiscal year. And, how are we sort of coming out in terms of budget to actuals with respect to expenditures?
Yeah, and those are all good points and good questions. And so I would say budget to actuals in terms of how we ended the year 23, 24 is basically how you described. We did bring back the actuals over the summer to talk about, where we were kind of up and down in terms of, revenues were pretty close to where we had budgeted, and expenditures were much lower. And so, part of that is helped build reserves, and a big part of that was rollover in capital. So I'm trying to, like, off the top of my mind, think of how much was capital, but I want to say the better part of 15 or 20 million was a capital rollover. And then we did have 5 million planned to go to reserve. So that's 5 more million off the top that was planned to go. And then I think we did have about 5 more million of unplanned savings that just helped fill up some of the reserve buckets. So we were able to fill reserves faster than we anticipated. So I think the point there is all the revenues that we do receive, whether it's more or less, if in this case, than the expenditures, gets reinvested back into the system. So it doesn't go nowhere. It goes back into reserves, or it goes back into projects, or it helps inform future rate planning decisions. So we did document the way that the year ended, and I can kind of bring back an item to kind of recap that if we need to, in the sense of how last year ended. But that's part of getting the audit for the year, and that was part of our reserve planning discussion. So on that front, it was a good year in the sense that we were able to make more than we expended, and we were able to fill up the reserves more quickly, as I mentioned, than we had initially planned. The capital program always will have kind of this lumpy kind of, roll forward piece to it, because nothing happens exactly as of June 30th each and every year, right? So that's going to be with us this year as well. We're going to probably have projects that aren't expended and have to roll over to the next year. And then there's also just, things happen for delays. So that will not be, something that doesn't happen going forward. Second part of your question, remind me again what it was.
I think I was asking, how we're doing with respect to budgets and actuals in this fiscal year.
Budget actuals. So we do come back each and every month with our finance committee report, kind of showing where we expect to be. And I want to say it was in either March or April, we forecasted a net savings of about 6 million, meaning I think we're expecting some level of shortfall with revenue still, I think in the 2 to 3 million range, but we're expecting a much better savings in the range of 7 to 8 million in savings. So we'll have a net about $6 million more than we expected at the end of this year. A lot of that will be influenced by the next month or so in terms of invoices coming in and our final month of revenues. But we are going to have a surplus in terms of more revenue than expenses again. And that's what I was mentioning at the beginning. We'll bring that back to the board in the summer. We'll have an opportunity to kind of think about reserve policies, and do we want to put that towards a building reserve fund? Do we want to kind of let the unrestricted revenue continue to build up, or are there other uses? But we are projecting at this point about a $6 million surplus, largely driven by expense savings and, somewhat offset by our revenues. We're not quite coming in to 100% of what we projected, but we're like 97%. So
right,
it's a small shortfall.
Right. Because I think to Larry's earlier point, if we are hitting reserve targets based on our policies and guidelines, potentially those savings are giving us more flexibility with respect to the capital improvement projects, the water supply, AMI, and the building fund. And it would be great to be in that position to have that additional flexibility. Be good to have your, maybe when you come back with the end of the year report for 24, 25, it would be good to have a discussion around that.
Yes, definitely. Well,
I have two more comments. Oh, a quick one. Don't forget about the unfunded reserve of the pension. That's still a topic of discussion in the community.
Mhm.
And I'd like to compliment Alex and his group on changes in philosophy, and Ben, for accomplishing more in the capital program. It was limited, I believe, more by attitude than anything else in previous people who had your job previously. And you don't have that attitude. You're able, willing to commit to get it done. And I appreciate that very much, because that's made the difference in taking on more work and more projects.
Ron, do you have anything? You're good.
I'm good. Thanks, Brett.
Yeah, Brett, thanks again. I think what stands out or what's highlighted in your presentation for me is that we've asked our customers for increased revenue, and we've turned it around quickly and are putting it right out on the other side and responsible reinvestments into the system. So Ben, thank you for that. It's good to see that we're spending the money wisely and actually not sitting on it, moving out and strengthening the organization. So that to me says, I think we're on the right path. So thank you. I did have a question on the AMI piece, and I'm not sure, it's more of a clarification. You talked about contribution reserves are going to go down 1.5 million in next year's fiscal. Is that to offset AMI increases? Did I catch that?
Well, it was a part of the kind of the final budget piece there, where I think as the discussions ensued today, where we're getting to a point where we've kind of hit most of our targets and reserves. And so the plan was, do we continue to say, no, we can't fund AMI and we need to, putting more money into reserves into the second year of this budget, or can we start to free up some funds for a project like AMI? So I don't know if it was a one-to-one decision, but it's certainly in the overall prioritization of the district. I think we didn't need to, in that second year, refill an unrestricted reserve more than we needed to move forward on the project for AMI. So that was a priority.
Understood. And so that begs the question, is AMI increasing at a rate faster than we had budgeted for?
Yes, is the answer to that. Yeah, we had in the original plan, we had only begun to fund it in year 2 of the budget, and now we're funding it in both years and even more in year 2 than we originally planned. So we are accelerating AMI.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I'd like to see at some point how much that's escalating, that project itself, just because it seems like it's starting to grow pretty fast compared to other stuff that we're doing. Understanding there's, market forces that are driving some of this, and those are to be considered in the equation, just for my own curiosity to see how much we're going up on that.
Okay.
And that was all my questions. Anything else? Great. Any public comment?
Yes, there are two, Mr. Phil Slaughter and Larry Minikis.
Thank you very much for the presentation and for the board comments. It's good to see our deferred maintenance becoming less deferred. Keeping in mind that conservation or demand management is the stated #1 objective of the district's water supply program, I was a little surprised that it was listed under the phrase water efficiency exactly one time, and there were no budget dollars attached to it. Yesterday, I hunkered down with a 105-page staff report for the operating and capital budget. I think I missed the 1,000-pager that you folks got. I made it all the way through and again was surprised that in the entire document, conservation was included only once with actual budget dollars attached to it. And in that case, it showed the $651,000 budget dropping by 6.5% over the next 2 years. Demand reduction was mentioned once as a key focus, but there were no programs or budgets associated with it. And water efficiency was mentioned as a function of the Water Resources Division, where personnel budgets are staying flat at 1.7 million. But again, there were no specific programs or activities or goals or projected outcomes included. Recycled water was mentioned in the background section, but there wasn't a reference to its potential role in demand management. I think it's possible that a customer or an interested party reading this budget document to get an idea of how the district plans to invest in its commitment to water efficiency would come away with more questions than answers. In fact, climbing out of the weeds and looking at the top line numbers, which show a budget increase of 14% overall and a 36% increase in the capital fund, it looked to me like the proposed budget is based on the need to increase rather than decrease water consumption. It also turns out that of the 36% capital increase, 20% of that, or more than half, is required to fund a major increase in imported water from Sonoma. Primarily, I think, so that super users can continue to use hundreds of gallons of potable water a day to keep their lawns green. If true, the need for higher water use to make the budget work would be in direct conflict with the stated goal of efficient water use. It's also in conflict with board members' stated desire for equity among ratepayers, as we will all pay to keep those lawns green. I ask every board member to keep that in mind and vote tonight with consideration for all their constituents, including the vast majority who try their best to conserve water. Thank you.
Thank you. Ben, just a clarification question. When we allocate money for AMI, is that going into water resources budget as part of conservation?
So I'll take a stab at that first. So when we budget AMI, we budget it in the capital fund. And so it doesn't get associated so clearly with water efficiency or conservation or water resources, but the staff that support that is in that exact division. So within Paul's division of water resources, the AMI program manager will work very closely with the water efficiency department over the next years. And while the capital cost of putting in AMI is going to be, $20 to $30 million, we'll say for now, that would be, well in advance or well in excess of any annual budget that conservation has. And it'll be the impacts down the road of once that's in, all the afterwards activities that we start to see the investment in our water efficiency group to handle all the activity that comes from that, from the data that we're getting and from the notices to action that you get from AMI. So this would be the beginning of that, the capital investments, the beginning, and then the operating expenses and the operating support you'll see in coming years.
Great, appreciate that.
And on top of that, just for clarification, the Water Conservation Group is staffed at a higher level than it's been in the last 10, 15 years. We have the master plan, conservation water efficiency master plan in play, and we're moving forward with that. And we'll be bringing an update to the board this month on the latest in conservation. So it is, as it's been for decades, a top priority of this organization, and staff appreciates and understands that policy direction. And we're going to continue to strive and, maximize every possibility to conserve this resource.
But maybe it would be a good idea to put that budget in the water efficiency. That's an interesting thought.
Where it belongs. Right. It's this grouping, and it's not clear this super big, significant investment in conservation with AMI. It didn't jump out at the commenter tonight.
Ben, I think I'm glad to hear that we'll have an update on progress with the water efficiency master plan, which I believe we approved about a year ago, and after a process working with an outside consultant to develop that plan. Because sometimes I think when it doesn't come back for updates and review, there's a tendency to forget that there are a prescribed set of activities focused on conservation that are determined by the master plan that we all agreed upon and that we have funded. So having that update will be a good, I think, reminder for everybody.
Great, thank you. And Mr. Mickey, thank you for standing there patiently.
No, that's fine. Brad, thank you so much for your presentation this evening. It was very detailed, and I appreciate all the comments here this evening. I just want to add where there could be a little more granularity, and that's you're showing two charts where with historical budget trends, the capital and operating funds expenditure levels over 10 years, and you also do that for staffing. And I want to focus on the three pie charts. Be really helpful from a granular level to see a 5 or 10 year trend on that. It would just be very helpful in these meetings to understand where things were and where things are going. Thank you.
There are no further speakers.
Okay, thank you very much. We'd like to go ahead and have a motion to adopt the budget, please.
So moved.
Second.
Terry, roll call.
Director Russell,
Aye.
Vice President Smith.
Aye.
Director Kusch,
Aye.
Director Mayor,
Aye.
and President Sampson.
Yes.
Thank you.
Great. Moving on to 9B, award of environmental services contract for the ARC project.
Good evening, Paul Sellier, Water Resources Director. We are here with an action item for the board tonight, and joined by Lucy Croy, our Water Resources Manager, who will share a few thoughts on this item before requesting your action. I would just note tonight, as a level of indication of the dedication of your staff, Lucy was at the dentist this afternoon for about 2.5 hours. So if there's something you don't understand, she's just a little numb.
He knew he had to tell a joke tonight. So, so as Paul mentioned, Lucy Croy, Water Resources Manager, still finding the new words for that title. So we're here tonight for moving on a significant step for the Atmospheric River Capture Project. With the preferred alternative selected a few months ago, the item tonight is to bring on an environmental consultant to perform the analysis and documentation related with the environmental review and regulatory permitting with the project. In April, Carollo Engineers was selected to perform the engineering design of the project. And over the last few months, staff has been working to issue a request for proposal for the environmental services for the project in tandem. We sent out the RFP to 4 firms, and we heard back from 2 firms and 2 very competitive proposals that we received back and interviewed both through a competitive process in late March. And staff, we had a team composed internally. We met with both teams and through the interview process, have recommended Panorama Environmental to move forward as the environmental consultant for the ARC project based on their responsiveness to the RFP and the project requirements that we see moving forward with a large project as such. They demonstrated quite a good awareness of the project and the key areas that we see that will be very important moving forward with a project of this size, and areas such as public outreach and working with public entities in the North Bay. And in addition to their technical strength, they also showed quite a bit of adaptability. We heard from other agencies that they've worked with that they're very adaptable with on projects. We've also worked with Panorama on the biodiversity fire fuels improvement project with the watershed, and they've always produced very high quality work. So we think they are very qualified for this project, and with their adaptability on a project of this nature in which we'll be conducting design work in parallel, it's important to have a consultant that will be able to work collaboratively with our design consultant. As such, we've also included optional services in the design, in the contract award, in the total. And that's because as we move forward, there could be some changes to the design and the alignment that will need additional environmental services in order to figure out how best to do the documentation and the permitting. So with that, we feel that Panorama is a strong team to move forward with for the environmental permitting for the ARC project, and staff recommends the Board of Directors approve a professional services agreement with Panorama Environmental and authorize the general manager to negotiate and execute the contract for the Atmospheric River Capture project environmental compliance and regulatory agency permitting services contract in the amount of $1,051,561 with optional services for $198,248 for a total not to exceed of $1,249,809. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Great. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Director Russell. Director Kush.
Yeah, thanks, Lucy. Lucy, is this the same as an EIR that's going to inform CEQA?
So it can potentially, we expect that it can potentially be an EIR. They will determine as they move through the environmental documentation what level is needed, but they have scoped it as such. So yes, the short answer is yes. And as we move through it, it depends on what level of environmental documentation is required by.
So there, we may not require a level that is designated an EIR.
Given the size of the project, we expect it will be, but it is through the process will be determined.
Okay.
Yeah, and the contract also speaks to the potential need for NEPA, which may be driven by either species that are found or whether we decide to apply for federal funding, should any of that still be available.
Yeah.
Okay. No other questions. Thank you.
Director Smith.
Yeah, great. I'm super proud of our beginning investment in this massively important project and support the choice of this consultant.
Director Mayer.
No comments?
Okay. For information purposes, the timelines on this contract, how far is this going into the future? When do we see this wrapped up?
We see this being performed very much in tandem with the design contract with Carollo. So we expect that if the project does proceed down the road of a EIR, that documentation would be issued, draft would be in next summer, and it would be wrapped up in late 2026. So it lines up with final design.
Okay, great. That's helpful. I think moving forward, especially on RFPs are $1 million plus, it'd be interesting to see who else put in and how their bid and how they scored for something like that. But I definitely support moving forward with this. And I'm really excited to get this project moving. So thank you and appreciate the sacrifice you made coming from the dentist today. With that,
sorry. One more question. Lucy, if it does, if the environmental review reaches the level of a full EIR, will we have to revisit the contract?
No, this has been scoped for the EIR level.
Okay, so there's a sort of a not to exceed them. They will bill as costs are incurred.
Yes.
Okay.
There are no comments.
Okay. With that, let's go ahead and entertain a motion to approve item 9B.
So moved.
Second.
Roll call.
Director Russell,
Aye.
Vice President Smith,
Aye.
Director Kush,
Aye.
Director Mayer,
Aye.
President Sampson.
Yes.
Thank
Moving on to item number 10, future board and committee meetings.
This Friday, there will be two meetings, the Lagunitas Creek TAC meeting and the NBWA. Just a heads up, Lagunitas Creek TAC will be at the Mount Tam Conference Room. The following week is the AWWA Annual Conference, and then towards the end of next week is our Watershed Committee meeting. Following that week, the week of June 16th, we'll have our regular board meeting, and then the Tamales Bay Foundation will have its meeting on Wednesday of that week. Then furthermore, the last week of June, we'll have our Planning Committee and Finance and Administration Committee meeting.
Great. Thank you very much. And with that, we'll go ahead and adjourn the meeting.